Sports card speculation and flipping can be both profitable and a lot of fun, but don't think for a second that it's all sunshine and rainbows on the way to the big pot of gold. There are hidden traps that you need to know about, and at the end of the day, the house is the only one who always wins. Let's get realistic and crunch some numbers. Let's data dive. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Data Dive powered by Market Movers. My name is Tyler Nethercott, better known as Teapot, and this week I'm diving into some really important financial figures to ensure that you don't lose track of your cost basis, forget to value your own time, or set unrealistic expectations for yourself en route to big losses. As always, this video is brought to you by Market Movers. Visit marketmoversapp.com and use promo code DIVE when you check out, and you'll get 14 days completely free to try out Market Movers, then 20% off for life as long as you're subscribed. Now let's get into the data. All right, so we're basically gonna cover a few different things today. One, how to calculate your break-even point on the sale of a card. Two, how grade multipliers, or ratios as we call them, can be both confusing and deceiving. And then finally, a few tips to ensure that you sell at the right price and at the right time. So let's get right into it. I'm gonna start out with a few examples, a tale of some different trajectories for some basketball cards here. I've got Jalen Brunson, and I've got his Prism Silver PSA 10 and PSA 9. And what I did was I went back to the point where his cards really started to take off. If you've been following basketball or this channel or the SCI channel, you know that Jalen Brunson was super hot in the playoffs, and then the Knicks got bounced and he came down, back down to earth. So what we can see is his prices basically went up at their high point from when they started to take off, upwards of 100 to 125, almost 135%. And then they started to come back down. So when you're speculating on sports cards, what you need to understand is your break-even point. It's not enough to say, I bought this card at $50. If I sell it for $60, cool, that's $10 in profit. That only works in particular if you're dealing in cash, if you sell and buy in person or without any fees, without any taxes, without any shipping costs, without any other hidden expenses. So this is the first example that I'm going to use, and we're going to jump over to a spreadsheet and look exactly what you should be taking into consideration. The second card that we'll look at is a guy who went even more nuclear, and that's of course Anthony Edwards. His cards went up at their highest point, 186% on his PSA 10, 163% on his PSA 9. Those cards have been slowly coming back down to earth, not quite to the levels that they started at, but we're going to look at those and see if now might be the time to buy Ant-Man. And then finally, Stephen Curry, who obviously, that Warriors dynasty is clearly over. They've come to an end, unless, who knows, maybe they can wheel and deal and bring in some more pieces. Steph still very much looks like he has life in him. The rest of the guys on that team, I think they're going to have to make some moves. And so since the playoffs basically began and the Warriors weren't a part of those playoffs, his cards have been coming down 14% and 11% respectively. And keep one thing in mind, when you're talking about percentages that go up versus percentages that come down, the up numbers are always going to look bigger just based on the way that percentages are calculated with the numerator and denominator. A card that goes up, it's going to look like this big number, 100%. Well, that means it went up double. The same on a card that comes down would be a 50% decline. So don't let that kind of little number difference create any cognitive dissonance. You're talking about sometimes significant dollar losses on cards that look like they've only come down nominally in percentage. So what did I do? I went over, geek out a little bit in some spreadsheets. I'm going to walk you through this. There's a lot of numbers here. Don't panic. I'll kind of explain it to you, and we'll look at each of these scenarios and kind of how you should be thinking about this. So this is Jalen Brunson's Prism Silver. This is his PSA 10 price on any given of these dates. This is his PSA 9. Here's the ratio to show what can happen from one date to the next and the wild discrepancies on a spot price between different cards. Now, as an aside, if you haven't yet, you're going to want to watch the episode that I did on the Jeff Wilson podcast with Jeff, talking about some of the challenges that we face internally at Market Movers, sourcing pricing data, reviewing that pricing data, making sure that we match it correctly to cards, but also just the general challenges of knowing what your cards are worth in the sports card hobby. And that doesn't matter if you're doing it for short-term flipping and speculating purposes, more of a long-term investment into a card, or just for your own collection. You still want to make sure that you're always getting the best value on that buy and sell end of those transactions. So go watch that podcast when you're done with this one. So what I did here after that was I looked at the price differences in these cards, from one day to the next, And then here's the difference, in actual dollars. Sometimes percentages can look really nice, but the dollars are really what matter, and the dollars are how you should value your time. I calculated the break-even point for each of these cards. So this is the 10, this is the 9, and that's based on those opening prices, what you would need to sell those cards for. Now, how did I get to this number? This could vary a little bit on a few things. One, where you sell your card, and two, your state income tax, or rather state sales tax percentage. It's 6% here in Georgia. It was 6% back in Michigan, where I'm originally from. It may be more or less depending on the state that you live in. And maybe if you do this full time, you're set up resale exempt through eBay. If you're actually filing your taxes at the end of the year and buying and selling enough, then obviously you may not pay sales tax, but you're going to pay that on the back end when you file your taxes at the end of the year. So what I did here was, here's the kind of fancy formula. If you look in the formula bar, you'll see that I'm calculating this number, and then I'm multiplying that by 1.06, which is what I would pay. That's my fully loaded tax cost, right? After sales tax, that's what I'm paying. By the way, this does not include shipping. So this doesn't include shipping, not the cost to ship the card to me, which really probably should be part of this. I could add $5 or $10 or whatever. This doesn't include the shipping cost if you decide to list and sell your cards with free shipping, which can sometimes look better and help entice buyers. This doesn't include insurance, any insurance you might want to pay to help cover the risk of loss or damage by USPS, which unfortunately seems to be going up quite a bit. And this doesn't include the overall value of your time. So you got to take all those things into consideration. So I multiplied by sales tax. And then what I did was I divided by 0.87. Why did I divide by 0.87? That gets you to your 13% fee structure in reverse to know what the total is that you need to hit. So in this case, if you bought this card on April 8 for $200, you need to sell this card for at least $244 or you're actually losing money. So that's a $44 difference. Same thing here, $45 for this card. You need to sell it for $55 to break even. So then I went and looked at dates where this card sold in both a 10 and a 9 over the ensuing, 6, 8, 10, 10 weeks, whatever, and looked at those price differences. And you can see, if I go back to Jalen Brunson's chart, there are points in time where the buyer of a particular card or the seller on the flip got really fortunate. So in this case, if I bought the PSA 10 at this high point, I'm not feeling as great as if I bought the PSA 9, which is down in this valley. And likewise, if I'm the seller and I thought, ooh, it's hot, Brunson's really hot. Look at this card just sold for $318, this 10, $318 on April 15. And then all of a sudden I listed on auction and it goes for $229. Well, the buyer's feeling really good about that. The seller is feeling terrible. That can be part of the gamble of running auctions on these cards if they sell really low. And in most cases, when you see that kind of a dip, that's exactly what happened. So you're looking to identify, as a buyer, you're looking to identify some of these spots in different grades where you're buying, where there's that gap, that delta between the two grades. And that's where you see that ratio looking really skewed. For example, 5.68 on the 10 to 9. In contrast, 3.05. That's a massive ratio difference on the same two grades on the same card, 10 to 9. So we're going to get a little bit more in a minute into average ratios and how those can be useful but also deceiving. But take a look at those things and know that day to day, price to price, marketplace to marketplace, all of these things can contribute and factor to big differences in prices and whether or not you can actually make any money on these flips. So as I'm looking at this, what I did is I kind of color coded it. Yellow means you're making money, but it wasn't really worth your time. Red means you flat out lost money. White's kind of where we're starting to get into a little bit of profit. Maybe it was worth your time and risk tolerance. And then green is like, yeah, I feel pretty good about this for what I put into the card. So that whole journey of Brunson over, what did we say? That's like, that's basically 2 months, right? 2 months. There was only a window here, really, of like 2 weeks where I would say it was worth your time on the PSA 10 for the dollar amount, and only really maybe a few days. In spite of that big curve, only a few days really where it was worth your time on the PSA 9 to go after that card where you made some significant profits. So by the way, this is the actual net. This is not the break even. So I know it's a little confusing, but this is the break even at the top. This is what you would have netted on those sales if you sold them after that final sale price. So you're kind of taking a look at this, making $164 on a $408 investment. That's net $164. That's not a bad profit, obviously. But you got to keep these things in mind. So obviously we cover the top 5 cards going up every week on the Sports Card Investor channel. That can look really exciting when you see a card that went up 20%, 25%, 30%, 100%. But what you have to keep in mind is that this number is actually roughly 21%. So that's sort of your magic number, assuming your fees. And you may want to even get closer to like 25% or 30% or 40% to say, is this worth my time, plus those shipping costs, plus the risk that I'm putting into multiple cards, presumably. So that's what's going on with this Brunson card. Now, Anthony Edwards, a little bit different story here, but this was truly anomalous. The Edwards craze that we saw was wild. It was also an incredible roller coaster of ups and downs, significant ups and downs, to where if you had bought this card, his PSA 10 for $643, your break even was $783. Your break even was $186 on a $153 purchase for a PSA 9. And almost immediately, a couple weeks later, we started to hit the playoffs. You're starting to see money. So let's go back and look at his trajectory. Now, the hard part here is you see this card up 50%. Okay, so 21% is your break even, 50%. A lot of times that's where I start to go, yeah, I'm probably going to sell this card. I'm just going to take the money. There can be the regret on the other side of that equation. And the question that I like to ask myself, or I like to pose to others, is which scenario are you going to feel more sick about on the other side of a transaction? If you missed your sell point, so say it goes up to 50%, and you say, no, I'm going to hold it, and then it comes back down to even and you end up losing money on it, is that going to make you feel really nauseous? Or is selling at 50% only to see it go up to 150% and missing that window going to make you feel more regret? If you can sort of identify those two things, you'll kind of have your North Star in how you make these decisions about when things go up. Most people will tell you profit is profit. You're also trying to read the tea leaves a little bit on the trajectory of a team and a player who's active in the playoffs and getting a lot of buzz. So Edwards really went up significantly. Then he came crashing down. Then he bounced back up a little bit. Then he came crashing down. Then he bounced up. Now he's down a little bit. I think with Edwards, and unlike Brunson, who's kind of leveled off, he's sort of leveled back to where he started. Edwards, I think, will end up settling in this price range. So if you're still really high on Ant-Man, and again, this is your decision to make. Please do not just take my advice. I'm just sharing my opinion. My opinion is that this is probably where he stabilizes. He could come back down. He could come down $191 and $885. He could come back down to $660 and I guess $185, on the PSA 9. That's actually about break even. But it's hard for me to see that happening. I think he's solidified himself as a guy that people are really excited about. He's still incredibly young. Wemby's super hot. He's kind of taken the reins over the rookie classes from the last few years. So I do think that he's sort of leveled off and could have some buzz going into next NBA season. Let's look the last one here at Steph Curry. Now he's obviously at the end of his career, near the end of his career. Who knows? He's very athletic, very healthy. Maybe he'll continue to play for a number of years to come. But these cards have come down, and you've seen these big price swings. By the way, you'd still be profitable here on Edwards, but like I said, this was very anomalous. This is not the normal trajectory for cards. So that's kind of the golden egg that everybody would have made money on if you had gotten in early on Edwards. But this is the cautionary tale with somebody like Steph. Now, I might hold Steph cards long term. I wouldn't necessarily feel the same panic or urge to try to flip Steph cards. If I'm buying a player like Curry, maybe I'm doing it more for the long term and not the flip, but there is still speculation that happens even on big time veterans. So this is his 9 and his 8, because this is a card that doesn't have as many graded copies. It's from 2009. Back on April 15, you had 1130 and 650 was the sale on these two cards. So you were at a 1376 and 792 break-even point, and these cards have just continued to come down. So if you had bought in then, that was basically a really bad time to buy Steph Curry, because they got bounced, and now it's into the offseason, and nobody really cares, and all of a sudden this card's down $407. This is what your loss would have been after fees. So that's what this is saying. If you were to sell that card today, it's down a couple $100 from where it started, but this would be your loss after fees. And so if I'm looking at this, unless you have to sell the card, there's no sunk cost fallacy for me here. I wouldn't be selling this card because I think this is a low point for Steph Curry. I might be looking at this and looking to try to buy one of these cards if they are on eBay selling for this transaction price, hoping for the long term that these are going to go back up. So that's how I kind of look at this. you have to take into consideration that fully loaded expense of buying and selling, of transacting, and factor those things into your costs. And especially if you are filing taxes, make sure you keep track of those numbers. Don't just report on your gross sales dollars, report on those numbers after fees and payouts. Let's talk about ratios a little bit. I'm going to kind of zip through this a little bit, but I'm going to tell you that ratios, grade ratios, for example, PSA 10 to PSA 9 of the same exact card, same player, set, variation, etc., 10 to 9, we kind of go into this with a little bit of an understanding of a rough ratio of 2.7 to 3.1, typically in that range. I'm looking at Luka here. This is his base Prism rookie card, his pink ice, and his silver, and this ratio is drastically different. We're talking about 2.5 for his base, 2.8 for his pink ice, and 3.5 for his silver. What does that tell me? Maybe it tells me that people who dabble in a little bit higher end cards, 4-figure cards and up, have more money and would like to go after the PSA 10 versions, the best copies of these cards. Maybe that's what it tells me, but what if we shift gears and we look at some of the other players? Jason Tatum, well, he's at 2.8. And this is a 14-day average, by the way. He's at 2.8 on his base, only 2.9 on his silver, so those are nearly identical, whereas Luka was 2.5 to 3.5. And then his green, which is very sought after because of the color match, is at 3.1, does demand a little bit more of a premium. Let's look at silver cards from the same draft class of players. Luka's at 3.5, seems pretty high, right? Well, Trae Young is at 4.1, and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is at 4.6. Now this has a lot to do with pop count. 637 on PSA 10 versus 1966 on PSA 9. Really bad gem rate on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander Prism rookie cards. The centering was notoriously bad, especially on the rookie, he was missing the rookie card logo, which did not come into it, but there were some specific aspects on either side where Shai had centering issues with his Prism rookie cards in particular, and that caused a really low gem rate on those Prism cards. So that's why you'll see these premiums for a PSA 10 on Shai. So it's not enough to go into a transaction and say, well, this Shai in a PSA 10 hasn't sold in a while. How does the 2.7 multiplier sound to you, sir, after this 9 just comped out at whatever, $500? Don't get caught up in that trap. You kind of need to look at the cards themselves within the specific player. Here's the base cards, 2.5, 2.6, 3.4. Again, it's the gem rate issue with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Now here's where it gets really wonky. You'd think like maybe the higher end cards, the 10s, command the biggest premium like we saw with the silvers and the greens and other things from Luka and Tatum. But then you get into something like a Kaboom, which are just far more short printed in general. And it does seem that when cards are maybe lower in print runs in certain cases and inserts and case hits and things like that, non-numbered stuff, it actually goes in reverse. So we're looking at the 10 to 9, and it's not break even, but it's pretty close. 1.3x, 1.5x, 1.8x on those price comparisons. You got to know that when you're going into a Kaboom. Again, you don't want to get caught into a situation where you're under or overpaying for a card, not knowing how these things kind of relate to each other. Let's look at our intelligence reports. So this is an unlimited feature in Market Movers for unlimited members. And I put in Luka Doncic cards from all different years. So I'll show you my filters. I put in Luka PSA 10 to PSA 9 all these years, Luka Doncic. I'm filtering by cards $20 and up over the last 14 days, an average ratio of just 2.4. Just 2.4 on PSA 10 to PSA 9. I did the same thing for Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, 2.5. And I did the same thing for Victor Wembanyama, 2.7. So his newer cards, people may be paying a little bit more for PSA 10s. So the point is, you can kind of get into these ratios. You can look for some price differences, but really what you have to do is look at those specific cards, or at least the ones from the same player and the same set, and see what they generally transact for if you're trying to get to a price on a card with a negotiation with somebody else or to figure out what to pay. The last thing I want to show you here, and then I'll give you a couple tips to make sure you time your sales right, is this conversation related but unrelated around the ratio of PSA 9 to raw now. And this is the one that's really interesting. So a lot of people have been making videos and saying, raw is barely selling for any more than PSA 9. That is definitely the case on some cards, but I put in Wemby here, for example. First of all, don't pay attention to this because this is a massive outlier, because this is his perforated Sports Illustrated for kids that is Pop 6 none higher on a PSA 9. That's why it's a big outlier. But if you come down, you'll see plenty of cards that are selling for 2x, 1.5x, 1.8x. Now you need to factor the grading cost into that. So in this case, you'd be losing money at $26 raw 41 in a PSA 9, you'd be losing money on the cost of grading. But then it's super weird because they're kind of right. If you switch the ratio sort order, you'll find other cards that both sold recently for 1.53 and 2.5 in the opposite direction. So it is a bit of a head scratcher. It can make you kind of wonder, where is the value of grading on some of these? If you're thinking about sending your raw cards, go check out my other videos that I did on how to determine which cards to grade, and similarly kind of what your break-even analysis is on grading raw to PSA, to BGS, to whichever SGC, whichever company you want to use. I've done videos on that in the past, but you want to make sure you have a little bit of benchmarking to know what these things are selling for. Look at the gem rates, analyze your cards, and then think about those seller fees to know your break-even analysis like I showed you today. Last thing I'm going to talk about, I've used this before, set price alerts. So if I come back here and I look at this Jalen Brunson card, okay? Let's say I bought this Jalen Brunson card for $250 in a PSA 10 way back a couple months ago. I want to come in here, I'm going to buy the card. I'm going to add it to my market movers collection. I'm going to put in the details, and then I'm going to use this little alert icon to say, tell me when this card sells above my break-even threshold. So let's say that number was $290. I set a price alert, I hit add, and now I'll be notified. I'll get a push notification in my phone. I'll get an email telling me, hey, your card just hit its sell marker. It's time to go get it listed. So that's the first tip. The second thing, when you buy the card, and you can do this, you can do this theoretically right when you buy it on eBay through the app or on their website, get a draft ready. If this is your plan to speculate and flip, get a draft listing ready in your seller hub. Don't list it, but just get the draft ready with all the details. And if you have a price in mind, you can put it in there, but you're probably going to adjust that based on how the market's going. Get the card in, take a nice, really clean new photo of it, upload it. And when that card hits your sell marker, especially if it just happened on an auction, you're ready to go. Let's say that card just sold for $325 that you bought for $250. You're going to go list yours. If it just ended on auction on the website, you're going to go list yours for $5, $10 less on fixed price. And that person who just had that second bid increment is probably going to be regretting and going, oh, I should have maybe bid one more. They go back out and they search and they found your freshly listed item just now on eBay. And they're going to go, oh, I feel really good now because I just saved money and you've made profit. They feel good. I've had this work many times with different cards. So that's a really nice trick. And then the last thing is, it's just plain, don't forget to actually sell the cards. Unfortunately, I've done that too. That's the number one mistake I hear people make. Well, I bought the cards, it's really easy. I got them in the mail. I put them in a box in my office, and then I forgot to list them. Or I was busy with work and I didn't have the time to do it. Make sure you're going to have the time and dedication to actually sell the cards, or maybe don't be buying them at all, at least not for flipping purposes. So I want to know what you think when you're speculating on a card for short-term flipping. Do you remember to do your own break-even analysis? Are you using any kind of alerts to notify yourself of your sell points? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're down there, do me a huge favor, like this video, make sure to subscribe, share it with a friend. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, happy investing, keep on collecting, and make sure to have fun.